All right, welcome back to Firewall. I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. It's a Tuesday episode, so with us is both our friend and producer, Hugo Lindgren, and our friend and colleague, Megan Collins. Hello, guys. How are you?
Good morning.
I want to kick this off with a special birthday wishes. My dad, Gabe, turned 80 yesterday.
Wow. Happy birthday, Gabe.
We had a big party for him Saturday night. My mom did a great job planning it. People came in from all over the country for it, and it was really, could not have been lovelier.
You were going to give Pete Alonso for his 80th birthday. Three more
funny,
years.
Steve Cohen expressed his great frustration about that the same day. So that was a big topic at the party.
I'll bet.
So a couple things for today. One is in our occasional ongoing how-to series, I wrote a piece called How to Deal with Constant Ruminations. So we're going to talk through that, but I'm not going to read it. But it'll be up on Substack when you are listening to this. We're going to talk about Trump, and Hugo put some questions together that I don't know what they are, so we'll see. We're going to talk about scaffolding in New York City, and then I've got some recommendations.
Great. Well, why don't you explain sort of where the
idea,
inspiration came
the
from?
Times on last week reran a piece about how to stop ruminating, and I've had, as listeners know, OCD my entire life. Rumination is a big part of it, and especially if you sort of have a heavier negativity bias. So negativity bias is something that we all develop, humans, evolutionary, because it's what keeps us safe, right? It's what kept us from being eaten by lions, and what keeps us from staying in the house when we smell gas, things like that. But what it could also just mean is you interpret everything naturally in a more negative light. And if you have a combination of a strong negativity bias and the tendency to ruminate, you get caught in these doom loops. And that's a really shitty way to live. So I have put a tremendous amount of work into not doing this over a period of many years at this point. And I feel like I've gotten a good handle on it. This is not some like TikTok prescription of like, do these 12 things and you'll sleep better for the rest of your life. Like, these are 12 things that work for me. Some of them might work for you. All of them might work for you. None of them might work for you. But, at the very least, they're things that I have tried over a long period of time. So,
and there's nothing explicitly just in the inspiration for this about politics, about like the Trump era or anything like that. I mean, I know that this is not a tactic for dealing with Trump.
Although if you really, really hate Trump and you're starting to ruminate constantly about what he does, and if you let every little thing get in your head, you're losing and he's winning.
Right.
So arguably, if that is your nature, and I think we all know a lot of people like that, this might be an especially good time to consider some of these.
I'm going to ask my in-laws to listen to this podcast for this, because I spent a little time with them over the weekend, and they are ruminating about Trump. Yes, they are.
So we're talking about
you.
So, all right, first one is meditation. And look, I told myself for years and years, like, I just don't have the kind of brain that's suited for meditation. I think too fast, I jump around too fast, I ruminate too much, I can't do it. And then I've kind of realized, like, everybody thinks that, right? And I hit a point a couple of years ago in my life where I just needed to do anything I could to try to feel better. And so I really gave it a try, and I take a class once a week, and I meditate every day, 20 to 25 minutes. And you know what? It really does make a difference. Now, of the 20, 25 minutes I'm doing it, maybe 30 seconds is purely spent focused on my breath, and the rest is just all kinds of random thoughts going back and forth from my breath to my brain and back again. But if you just put in the reps, it eventually starts to kick in. And the great value of it is it gives you that extra beat. Like, I remember when Laurel and I were in Lisbon in November, I don't remember what it was anymore, but there was a day where I was upset and walking around. And then I think really only because of the meditation, I was able to take a step back and say, okay, I'm upset for these reasons. I'm ruminating about it. This is what's happening. And it didn't magically solve it. But once I had that perspective, dealing with it came a lot faster and easier. And that's really what it does, is it just gives you that extra beat. And I find incredibly helpful, but you just got to put the work in. Like, it's going to suck for a long time. And you just have to sort of trust that ultimately it will pay off. Next one is so obvious, which is exercise. But there's all of this science that shows that the single best thing any human can do for themselves is to move around and to exercise. I try to work out 5 days a week, 3 with my trainer lifting, 2 doing cardio. Not every workout is great, but it's kind of the same thing as meditation, which is if you just put in the reps, you get the benefit. Third is therapy, and these three all kind of fit together, because I would say, like, I really have a good therapist. And even with that, a third of the time, it's like wildly helpful. A third of the time, it's like somewhat helpful. And a third of the time, I feel like I'm just making up shit to talk about and, seeing if I can cut it off early. But with that said...
Do you ever cut it off early?
I have, yeah.
Yes.
With that said, it overall delivers tremendous benefit to me because I have a venue to talk about things. And what's great about my therapist, and I would recommend if you can find someone like this, is, she's a psychoanalyst, but she's also in many ways like a coach. So she doesn't hesitate to give me tangible advice. She doesn't hesitate to tell me what to do or not to do. I don't always listen to her, but I think she has good judgment, and I think she knows and understands me in a way that is different than other people. And so, and again, but with therapy, with meditation, with exercise, it's a collective practice and benefit, and you just have to keep doing it. The fourth is medication. So I've had OCD my whole life. I can remember it as early as 4 or 5. And yet till I was about 40, I resisted taking medication for it. And the reason why is I thought that it would slow me down, take the edge off. I wouldn't be as effective. And then I finally tried it and it turned out that was not the case at all. It only helped. So if you seriously have OCD, if you are diagnosed with it, and you are resisting medication because you think that it'll dull you or slow you down, it probably will not. It did not for me. Now, with that said, they don't really know that much about OCD, right? So they don't understand what causes it. So they give you SSRIs like Prozac, and that will help mitigate the symptoms. So when something is triggering, it won't last as long. I did, as listeners know, kind of a one-man clinical trial in 2024 with Mounjaro, because given that Mounjaro and GLP-1s in general impact sort of cravings for things, there was at least a view that maybe that could be for compulsive thinking too. Hard to know what worked or didn't because, it's totally anecdotal. But whether it was placebo or not, I think it did. I have stopped taking it simply because I lost too much weight and muscle mass, and that's important too. And my doctor just tried put me on a new med to see if that will help make up the difference. But the point is, I'm kind of constantly experimenting with these, and I would say I have an amazing doctor who is really also into this, and so she will experiment with me all the way around, and I think it's really helpful. The fifth is kind of the things you carry. So this one takes a little more explanation, which is I've come to define happiness as feeling good about myself on a sustained basis, and that really requires being good, or at least trying to be good. And the reason why is, and this is especially true because I have a heavy negativity bias and because I ruminate so much, is that my actions weigh really heavily on me if I regret something. So if I do something that I feel bad about and regret, I will definitely ruminate about it, and I will make myself miserable. And so what I found is doing the right thing and the generous thing usually makes sense simply because the cost of otherwise carrying it with me isn't worth it. It's not because it's more ethical and more moral and therefore better. It simply generates a higher return on investment than not doing it. All right, now let's do things that I don't do. So drugs. I was never a big hard drugs guy, but I love smoking weed. And the reason why is it got me to stop ruminating. So it was incredibly helpful, and I kind of justified it along those lines. But when it became legal, when it was illegal, there was sort of enough friction in sort of getting it that, like, obviously you could get it, but it was enough to sort of keep use in moderation. And when all of a sudden it was on every corner and totally available and really potent and so easy, right? All you have to literally do is get this vape pen where you just inhale and you get high and there's not even like any odor or anything. It was too much for me. I couldn't handle it, and I realized I was better off just quitting entirely than trying to do it in moderation. It's been 18 months as of last week, and I would say I am very, very glad that I did. Took effort to get there. Now it doesn't take much effort at this point. And if you can drink or do drugs or anything else in moderation and it's not hurting you, that's your choice. But if you struggle with it, especially now when it is so powerful and so ubiquitous, I would just say that quitting for me was worth it. Drinking, a little different because I was never a huge drinker, but in my mid-40s, my body just said, like, no more at all. So I would have a cocktail or a glass of wine, and then I have a headache for 2 days. And so I stopped drinking a couple of years ago. Every once in a while, I'll kind of test it. So like in December, I had this really shitty day at work. Went out for dinner with friends. Everybody was drinking. I was like, yeah, you know what? Fuck it. I'm going to drink too. And I had a cocktail. I felt great. I had half of another one, and then I had a headache for 3 days. So I don't drink. Social media, to me, and I've said this before on the podcast, but it is the quintessential unhappiness machine. It literally does two things. You go on life and you compare your real life, because you know what your real life is, with a totally curated fake version of someone else's profile, so you automatically feel inadequate by comparison. Then the internet because of negativity bias, the platforms know that the more toxic stuff they show you, the more likely you are to click, and the more you click, the more money they make. Shows you everything bad happening everywhere in the world all at once. So you feel bad about yourself and you feel bad about the world, and it just makes you unhappy. Now, I've got teenagers and they're on social media, and I get that. I think it would be hard to be 18 and 15 and not, but I'm 51 and I don't have to use it, and I don't. Next one are sort of people who aren't a good fit. So, you're not for everyone and everyone is not for you. And if you think about it, every relationship is based both on the way the one person behaves and then the other person perceives it. And sometimes the fit is just not right, right? And for me, nothing causes more rumination than personal conflict. If I have some or if I'm worried about some, I will litigate it and argue it and fantasize about it in my head constantly, and it just is a recipe for disaster. So I would say if there are people in your life who are sort of ceaselessly negative presences, or if they just require endless emotional caring and tending, or if they treat you poorly, worst of all, and that leads to rumination, you're better off cutting off those relationships. I've done a bunch of that in the last couple of years. It is very, very hard short term. There are hurt feelings, there are recriminations, there's anger, there's resentment all around. But long term, time after time, it has proven to me that it is worth it. A few other things that help. First would be relationships. All happiness science shows that the two things that really matter in life are purpose and having people who love you and support you unconditionally, and vice versa. And, I have different types of relationships with different people, but I am proactive about it. So I will really go about kind of making plans, doing things with people, going to dinner, going to Mets games, going to Knicks games, texting, checking in, because the closer I feel to them, the happier I am. And, a couple of years ago, I was going through sort of the dual challenges of divorce, and my daughter Abby at the time was sick. Thank God she's okay now. But people were great, man. People really, really were supportive in a way that, I don't know if I was surprised by it, but I was grateful for it. And so I even made a list of the 50 people I feel closest to. Congrats, you're both on there. And I will just sometimes go through it, and if I feel like I haven't talked to someone on there, I'll just send an email, just hey, or text, hey, check it in, just see how you're doing. I never, ever regret doing that. Next one is the right partner. So I am very lucky to have a partner in Laurel that I know I can count on for support, care, friendship, and love no matter what. It's constant. It doesn't go up and down. I feel seen. It doesn't mean we agree on everything, but whether it's a problem that one of us is going through or between us, we just kind of work through it until we get to a reasonable resolution. We let each other be who we are, and just knowing that I can count on her day in, day out gives me incredible confidence, incredible comfort, incredible contentment. And that's even beyond the fact that, we just really like and enjoy each other. So, obviously that's the biggest decision you can make is your life partner. But I will say that having the right one makes a big difference. And if you don't, in my experience, it's worth reconsidering. And the last one is purpose. As I mentioned before, when your life has purpose, when you feel like the things you're doing have meaning, you're going to feel more content and happy. When it's just this empty pursuit of wealth and status for its own sake, it never really works. There's this thing called the hedonic treadmill, which basically means you can just buy more and more stuff, but every time the dopamine hit wears off faster and you have to get something even fancier the next time around. And a lot of us know people who are, ultra wealthy and just obsessed with sort of the number and the luxury and the status, and they're not really all that happy. And for me, I just kind of work on almost a mathematical approach that if I do a lot of things every day that I think will give me purpose, it will overall benefit me, right? And so I just try to pack my schedule that way. So that could be stuff we do out of our foundation on mobile voting and on hunger. It could be volunteering at the soup kitchen every week because that gives me sort of a different type of purpose than, writing checks for hunger or writing legislation for hunger. It could be from just meeting with people on a pretty regular basis to give career advice. It could be the Gotham Book Prize that we created. It could be helping ensure that women in red states can get access to abortion meds via telemedicine through the work we do with Mayday Health. It could come from intellectually fulfilling activities. So that could be writing my Substack or column or this podcast or books or teaching or speaking publicly. Could be our bookstore, P&T Knitwear, where it loses a lot of money, but I think people know that, and they pat me on the back for how nice it is that I'm willing to lose this money. So it makes me feel good. And plus, since we're the only free podcast studio in New York City, when I kind of see people enjoying it and using it, I get a mild dopamine hit from that. I even carry these just $10 Dunkin' Donut gift cards. I got this idea from one named Caitlin LaCroix, who worked for us in the really early days of Tusk Strategies. We lost touch, but she would carry at the time these $5 Dunkin' gift cards. I increased it for inflation over time. And I just keep in my pocket, and when the mood strikes me and I see a homeless person, I hand it out. And I assume it helps them, but honestly, it just makes me feel good, right? And the truth is, buying a dopamine hit for $10, doing that is a lot better than buying a hit off of some total drug for $10. So for me, the best thing you can do with your time and your money are things that give you purpose. And so look, with all of that said, that doesn't mean every day is filled with meaning. Every day there's stuff I'd rather not do. I still have to work for a living and make money. I have personnel issues that I have to deal with and all that other shit. None of that is fun. And none of this is a magic bullet, right? Life is not and will never be an endless sea of bliss, because being human means confronting anxiety on a constant basis. You can't eliminate it. You can't but you can manage it. Sorry. Even if these ideas are not the right ones for you, I think the point that runs through all this is just do stuff, right? Don't just sit there and ruminate and feel bad for yourself. There's lots of different things. Some will work for you, some won't. There's probably ideas that you will have that haven't occurred to me or I've tried and haven't worked for me. But the more proactive you are, the better you're going to do. And look, I know that OCD is a tough way to live. And I have incredible empathy for everyone else who has it too. And my, sincere hope is that one day there will be a medical treatment for it, and you will take a drug, and you will not ruminate, and you will not have these issues, and that would be awesome. But until then, you've got to manage the best you can, and at least for me, these are the things that help.
Nice. Yeah. I have just one question about this,
Yeah.
and then we have to move on to Trump, which feels almost like counterproductive based on everything you just said. But we're going to do it anyway.
Sure.
So when you read other people on this subject, for example, that Times piece,
Yeah.
where do you find the stuff that doesn't fit? Like, what's because one of the things I like about your approach and the way you presented it here was that you're very kind of non-rhetorical about it. It's very personal, just very you. You're not like, there's not a lot of jargon in there from various things. Even on meditation, for example, because I feel exactly the same way you did or used to, which is just like, wow, it's such a drag for me, Anyway, but my point, my question is where do you find when you read pieces or look into books or whatever that it like where is the disconnect for you when there is disconnect?
Well, I don't know if it's disconnect, but oftentimes you'll hear about people's stories with OCD, and their problem seems so much more severe than mine.
Right.
Like Dax Shepard had this woman on who was an OCD expert, and she would talk about her patients and the challenges they had, and it was like, wow. I remember just listening to think kind of grateful because, I don't love the one that I deal with, but it's fairly minimal in comparison to what other people deal with. So I think that, oftentimes I kind of realize that the stories that I'm reading aren't necessarily relatable to me. It's kind of also when I quit smoking weed, I went in this Reddit group of it was supposed to be a support group for people who were trying to quit smoking weed. But the problem was their lives were so radically different from mine in every way that I couldn't relate to them at all. If I didn't post on it, but if I did, there's no way they'd be able to relate to me, I don't think. And so I stopped going on it. So for me, the biggest problem is just that these things are very idiosyncratic, and trying to find the other example that's exactly like yours is pretty tough. And so I think for me, a question of how do you adapt it?
It's interesting that I had a similar experience. I used to go to Al-Anon meetings, and I really liked them overall. I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing for people. But several times in a row, there would just be these really harrowing stories that would come out, and they were so much. They were so much worse than anything I was going through or anything that I really even knew about directly. That I found it was almost not good for me to be part of it. But it was interesting, and I don't. That's obviously not any comment on Al-Anon or whatever. I think for they do a lot of good for people, but It definitely was difficult for me. So
Yeah.
anyway, should we talk about Trump?
Sure.
Okay. So last week we talked about your little trip. I say it like that. What am I saying? Your trip to Toronto, where
Yes.
you sort of presented to Canadian business leaders about like how Canada could get tough with Trump if it wanted to.
Yes.
And they were horrified. And then you published your piece about that in the Globe and Mail, Canada's leading newspaper, I guess. I'm just curious what follow-up you've heard from it. Have you developed your thoughts on Canada's
it
knife
hasn't really
fight
changed.
with Trump?
I went on once. I didn't read the comments, but there was a lot of them. So I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah, I bet.
I do have one friend from college who lives in Toronto. He saw it and agreed.
did.
Then Michael Lasher, who was on the podcast last week, when he was at Sidewalk Labs, they tried to build this sort of city of the future in Toronto.
Right.
And so I both sent the column to him and to Dan Doctoroff, and we all kind of had a laugh about sort of how, in some ways absurd the Canadian business leaders are. But then Micah sent me a video of Pierre Poilievre, who's going to be the new prime minister when elections happen in May. And he was talking about his plan for sort of taking on Trump on the tariffs. And some of it did feel right in that the rhetoric was tougher. It wasn't whiny, at least, like
Right.
all those business leaders were.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it still felt very insufficient because he was like, well, we're going to impose retaliatory tariffs on you too, and we're going to be energy independent this way and that way. It's like those all might be like things to try to mitigate the impact on your country, but like Canada's economy is very small compared to the U.S.
Yeah.
Like the U.S. does not rely on exporting to Canada in any meaningful way that like you doing it back to us. I saw the Colombian president said the same thing that they're like, it doesn't matter, dude. You have no leverage. Like there are ways to fight with Donald Trump. There are ways to buy off Donald Trump. But you just saying like, I'm going to do to you what you do to me when you are a fraction of the size, like means nothing.
Okay. So on a related front, Trump is picking a fight with Denmark over Greenland.
Yes.
So if you were to go to speak to some Danish business leaders or perhaps a Danish political leader, is their situation different than Canada's? And how would you advise they do?
Well, first of all, I'm
Deal
not
with Trump.
sure. So the question is, what could Trump do to you, right? So I guess he could invade Greenland. He's not going to invade Denmark because it's a NATO country, and then everyone else in NATO would have to then invade the U.S.
Right, but Greenland is part of Denmark, right?
Sort of.
Isn't it?
It's like kind of independent. They have their own prime minister.
Trump must know that most Americans don't actually know this answer.
We don't
so
even know. So, but the point is, I don't know that the Danish economy is heavily reliant on exports to the U.S. in the way
They have that
the
one
Canadians
chip
are.
company, right? That's like the chip imaging company. That's like literally the most like important like part of the chip.
Then they have leverage if that's
shit,
true.
yeah.
Yeah.
So either way, look, if I'm the Danes, what I would do at least, and maybe I just don't, I clearly don't understand the Danish mentality or culture at all. I'd see what I could get for this thing, right? Like if you think about like a good general manager in
What?
sports, hold on.
Okay.
If you think about a good general manager in sports, when they call and ask about one of your players, unless it's the absolutely most untouchable thing possible, you're like, what are you going to give me for it? And like, who knows? Trump looks at this, I think, as great leaders conquer. Great leaders add to their territory, and therefore he wants to be remembered in 100, just in the same way he's talking about McKinley in many ways, who I think got Alaska, right? So in 100 years, he wants to be remembered like that, which means he might wildly overpay for Greenland because he doesn't give a shit about the cost to the U.S. Treasury, economy, anything else today. He's thinking about his legacy in 100 years. And so who knows? Maybe now Denmark's a pretty wealthy country, so I don't know if it's money, but maybe there are trade agreements, maybe there are products, maybe there's intellectual property. I don't know what it is, but I would.
So you say play ball, kind of? Or?
No, just explore it and see what you can get. Like maybe you can drive his desperation to the point, and then you can always pull it back.
Okay. So at the moment, it feels like Trump has this kind of endless capacity for like conflict and kind of confrontation. Do you think that we will get to a point where he's really going to need to pick his battles? Like this is just kind of coming out of the gate, and things are going to have to get a little more like, or is this just what we've got for the foreseeable
I think
future?
it's two things. One is, there was so much pent up demand on his side coming out of the gate that there was just like, hundreds of ideas that they wanted to get out there, and he always wants to make a bang, and he certainly did in his first week in office. That will dissipate in part simply because there just aren't a limitless flow of hundreds of new, interesting, controversial ideas, good or bad, that you could propose every single week, right? So it will slow down because of that, and also because he's kind of done most of what you could do via executive order at this point, and the rest of it requires Congress, and Congress is always hard to get anything through. And while there is a Republican majority, it is one seat in terms of voting right now in the House, and so actually getting anything through is going to be incredibly hard. But the other thing is, there's probably some strategy to it, which is just sort of sometimes propose really crazy shit. Matt Gaetz for AG, say just overturning the 14th Amendment with an executive order. That clearly is not going to work. But it appeases some of the crazies in your party, right? Hey, we listened to you. We tried the thing you wanted. And it sort of sucks up a lot of the oxygen. So then stuff that normally what might be hard to get through seems reasonable by comparison. And then all of a sudden, the stuff that you really do care about is a lot more achievable.
So AOC, you mentioned Colombia. AOC jumped in there a little bit, talked about how, the thing about, so Colombia, one of the big exports to the U.S. is coffee. If there's a 25% tariff on Colombian coffee in the United States, that's going to raise coffee prices for normal people.
Yep.
So that was her point. Very straight ahead, logical.
I think she's
true.
right. I mean,
but is it effective? Can she make any headway just saying something normal against Trump's?
Well, the question is the argument effective or is AOC an effective messenger?
I guess I want both
because
those
if the
answers.
argument is effective, absolutely. To me, Trump won in part, maybe even large part, because of both inflation existed. Now, again, I don't totally blame Biden for it because this was to try to save the economy and the country during COVID. The last one, the American Rescue Act, probably ultimately was a lot more money than it should have been. But even that had things like the child care tax credit that made a big difference in terms of childhood poverty. So, but at the same time, led to inflation. I think where Biden really screwed up was that they tried to gaslight the American people and act like there wasn't inflation or that, no, the rate of inflation is declining, so you're fine. You have nothing to complain about. And Trump, in large part, won because of that. People you can tell them every economic indicator is great. And when eggs cost 40% more, eggs cost 40% more, right? And most Americans drink coffee. Now, is AOC an effective messenger? No, because she's not credible in the sense that she is seen to be so partisan, so ideological, so self-interested. But she's absolutely right
Megan's
about the
making
argument.
face. I just want that.
But so is Trump, right? Trump.
Yeah, same thing. But Trump also couldn't deliver a message on the other side in the same. When Biden was president, there were attacks that Trump was not the effective messenger for because he was seen as too out there and crazy.
I guess what is for me, it's are you an effective messenger means, is it resonating enough with enough people where it is being talked about and where there's pressure coming from it? And that's where I think AOC out of any Democrat right now.
Yeah, but I just think that it would be good for AOC to be somewhat self-aware here, which is she's not wrong on this. She's right on the substance. She's very smart, right? She's right. But a regular Democratic governor, Kathy Hochul, Phil Murphy, Andy Beshear, whatever, just a much less exciting, much less interesting than AOC, but nonetheless, as a result, just more sort of normal. If they all start taking that message and saying, oh, here I am at this event in the grocery store in my state, and look, coffee costs this, that costs that can be incredibly effective. I just think that when it's AOC, the media can't, even if she is being as sort of straightforward as possible, the media can't separate her as this sort of larger-than-life figure from her a specific message about the increase in the price of coffee. So you almost want a messenger that is a lot more boring so that the message itself can shine through.
But on that, I don't disagree with that, but at the same, I disagree with some of that. But the idea is that if she's saying it and she's putting it out there, if Hochul started saying it, I don't know if there would be any attention to it. So I think that there's something
maybe
because you would be
I think there would
okay.
be. No, I disagree. I
the
think
media. That's the same reason that Trump was able to rise.
Because
they were more interested to hear what he had to say than a moderate Republican.
Right. But again, the goal here
Yeah.
isn't just to get media attention for the sake of media attention or social media for the sake of social media. It's to penetrate through to the real voters. The reason why inflation was so devastating is not because Trump was screaming about it, but because regular people saw it and felt it in their budget every single week when they went to the grocery store. That would be true here too. And so what you want to do is penetrate through so the next time the Trump polls, he sees he's being blamed heavily for the increase in price of coffee, and that's what changes his mind, not the DC media screaming, because they scream all day, every day, and it doesn't matter. So disagree. I think AOC is actually the worst messenger for
Can
this.
I push back on this just one more time? You're talking about, and I do have a problem with saying, regular voters versus just voters, right? But at the end of the day, there was in
engaged
November
versus disengaged. And the disengaged is 90% of the electorate.
The disengaged,
and that's
though,
who have
you would
to
argue,
reach.
though, right, that at least more of them participate in presidential elections than any
Yes.
other, right? So the disengaged here, and when Trump in AOC's district, when they did the kind of tally of votes, they basically figured out that more people voted for AOC in that district than they did for Harris.
Sure.
So there were crossover with Trump voters and people that would also vote for
a
AOC.
lot of Democrats ran way ahead of Harris. Josh Gottheimer, when he was at the fundraiser at my house last week, he won his district by 11 or 14, and she won by 1.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say, though, and you would say this about Josh, right, is that he's reaching more of his constituents than Harris did or that Biden did.
Yeah.
I would say AOC actually has way more of the ear than what you're giving her credit for, especially with working class people, because I think there's a lot of people in the Democrats, it may not be the same kind of voters for Josh, that are upset with the Democrats for all of the compromises that they have made with corporate donors and the, what people would say the upper middle classes. But at the end of the day, it's just the middle class, working class. I do think that there is more messaging from AOC than there is a lot of Democrats that have a microphone right now.
Well, right. I mean, the reason why we're sort of, it's the same thing. Right? I'm saying that she's a bad messenger for the same reason you're saying she's a good messenger, which is she's exponentially better at all of this stuff than Kathy Hochul and Phil Murphy and all those other guys. I just would argue that in this case, the media is not capable of separating the message and the messenger. And I think that as a result, it undermines the credibility of the message when you don't need to, because you have something a lot of stuff in politics that we scream about is very intangible, right? We scream about like the crime of migrants, but the vast majority of Americans don't see migrants one way or the other, whereas everyone sees it if the price of coffee goes up. Also, by the way, interesting in this case, there's a weird alliance where the corporate donors are actually very helpful, right? Because you know who also doesn't want tariffs? Corporate America, right?
Yeah.
It's going to make their profits go
Well,
down.
but it depends. I mean, they're fine with tariffs on some stuff. I mean, it's not like
if it's
there's
right.
one vote
But
on that.
if you're Starbucks or if you're Dunkin' Donuts or whoever uses a massive importer or grocery chains of Colombian coffee, and then you sell less of it because it's now 25% more expensive, you don't want that.
But I think people would view it, and I'll stop going after this, but I think people would view that corporate donor interests will have more power than working class interests. So in the response to Trump, I don't think that the Democrats are worried that, let's say Dunkin' Donuts is going to be impacted by this. They definitely will have more of a sway on whether or not that happens.
Right. You're going to have to increase your cards.
But it would be
$20
really interesting, just in the same way that Trump succeeded in part by putting together a fairly unique coalition. It would be interesting to see where there are places where the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the far left actually can partner, because if you combine their efforts, that becomes really unique in terms of reach and message and messenger and everything else. And there'll be times where they're diametric opposites on issues, but I think there are going to be some stuff where they actually agree. Look, the greatest hedge on Trump doing a lot of crazy shit is Wall Street, right? Simply because he cares so much about the market and so much views his success correlated with the stock market while he's president that, like, for example, you could go deport millions and millions of people here illegally, but the vast majority of them are working, and those businesses will suffer significantly if they lose their workers, right? Like, think about...
will suffer.
Yeah, like, talk about, AOC's are about coffee. If chicken processing plants lose 80% of their employees, a chicken breast is going to double in price. Or in LA, maybe he doesn't care about LA because he thinks it's all liberal, but you're going to have this already massive demand for contractors and home builders and everything to rebuild from the fires. That's going to compete with the Olympics, which can need a ton of it. And then you're going to deport everyone that's doing the actual work. That's a disaster, right?
Yeah.
So, there may be...
But he might be happy to see that disaster in Los Angeles, right?
Maybe in LA, but overall, I think it's harmful, even if it helps him there.
It's definitely harmful, but
I don't know if the Chamber of Commerce and the DSA are talking, but it would be fascinating. I would urge, not to either of them listen to this podcast, but I would urge both of them too, because you might have some places where you do come together, and even if you're doing it quietly, it may not be that you're standing together at a press conference, but even if you're sort of doing good cop, bad cop, or you're sort of behind the scenes, that might be really effective.
So the GOP is having a retreat in Miami this week. It's it's funny, just like the casual stuff that gets thrown in the coverage. So they're going to be talking about sort of getting together on the budget and making sure there's alignment, and just how much they can cut Medicaid, food stamps, and other
I don't think
social
they can,
programs to keep the tax cuts enacted. So you just started to answer the question before I even asked it.
I know. By the way, listener, I probably we get listeners who complain that I do that too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's my mom.
Hi, Hugo's mom.
So you started to say that they're not going to make those cuts. Is that what you said? They're not going to cut Medicaid. They're not going to cut food stamps.
No, I just think so. It's interesting. Bob and Lisa and I had this text exchange the other day where Lisa, who's runs Solving Hunger, and it is very. Our work focuses 99% at the federal level, at the state level.
State level.
But she was a chief of staff in Congress for 30 years, and I worked in Congress, and we're very aware of what's happening, and obviously it matters a lot to hunger. And so we've been very closely watching the proposed cuts to SNAP and things like that. And our budget's $1 million to $2 million total, close to $1 million for our hunger stuff, and we've got campaigns going right now in New York, Ohio, Arkansas, Delaware, Oregon. We might add Washington State. We might add Kansas. It actually has been an outstanding year for school meals in terms of states on both sides of the aisle proposing stuff. And we discussed, should we try to get involved in the federal thing? And we concluded no, because for $200,000 we can win in a state. We don't always win, but I think our winning percentage is about 80%. And I know how to stop SNAP from being cut in the budget, but it's a $50 to $100 million spend, right? Which is if you say, okay, who are the 50 to 100 Republicans in the House and Senate who are most vulnerable if their constituents know they did this and will blame them for it, and you start pounding the fuck out of them in paid media in their districts, they will go to Johnson and Thune and say, I can't vote for the bill with this in there, and it comes out. And that's true for Medicaid, for a lot of these things. So
but no one's going to spend that $50, $100 million.
Well, I hope someone, I can't, but I hope somebody will. I mean, what do all these fucking groups who are just in D.C. complaining all day do? Like, this is your time to step up. Like, sure, we don't need their help in the states because they're totally ineffective. Like, go do something.
So there's 3 cabinet appointments that are up this week. Lovely Robert Kennedy at HHS, Kash Patel at FBI, Tulsi Gabbard at CIA. So I guess Gabbard is considered the most likely to go down of the 3.
Oh, really?
That's interesting.
That was, I don't know, I read that in some newsletter this morning. I guess it's that what's his name?
I think she's the scariest.
You think she's the scariest?
I think she's the scariest.
So you think who do you vote for scariest?
If you had to pick one.
Wait, to go down of these 3?
Yeah, it's tough, man. There's a good fucking argument for each of them.
Yeah, I'd like to see them all go down, but that's obviously not going to happen. I think the most consequential thing would be Gabbard, because I think she might be like a foreign agent.
Yeah,
that's true. Although Kennedy, has some broad-based powers that affect people in very tangible, real ways. Right? We're talking about their health care, and then Patel. You have a head of the FBI who's deliberately just making lists and going after anyone they don't like. Yeah. Like, that's terrifying.
Okay, so here's an argument it just occurred to me. So if you think of bureaucracies that are more likely to be able to hide the important shit from the political appointee, you got to believe the FBI and the CIA have some idea of how to do that. Whereas HHS, they're probably not used to having just like a wrecking ball come in and be the, you know. So.
But I think that because I feel like since we don't really know Gabbard, RFK, at least you see him. At least all of his crazy, for the most part, is out there for display.
Yeah.
So I feel like at least you can wrap your arms around that versus Gabbard, who's just kind of like a mystery in the worst kind of ways.
Yeah.
And she was a Democrat.
So wait, what's your prediction? Who do they all 3 get through? 2 out of 3?
That'd be sad.
They couldn't stop Hegseth, and they had some good dirt on him.
Yeah. So Murkowski and Collins voted against Hegseth. Did a third also?
Yes, and Mitch McConnell.
McConnell, right? Though I don't know that McConnell's reliable now on everything. So the question is, are those 3? So I could see those 3 on Gabbard, right? Because if you were against Hegseth, you'd be against Gabbard.
Then you just need one more.
Then you need one more. And then on Kennedy, McConnell.
It looks like Lindsey Graham is kind of saying that he's out on Gabbard, but I mean,
okay, but he never, he always folds.
Spineless.
Kennedy, let's assume that for whatever reason, Murkowski and Collins were just solid no's all the way through. Yeah, I just don't know if there are 2 other members that just care enough about sort of public health. And then Patel, honestly, I think they're all, other than maybe Murkowski, who has a lot of balls, or Collins, who's running for re-election, and I think probably even Collins, I think they're going to be terrified that he's going to fuck with them.
Right.
And I think they're going to be like, forget it. Just
That's crazy.
Give him our vote. I know.
Yeah.
But like, that's the intimidation. Look, Hoover was managed to intimidate members of Congress for decades. So,
Yeah.
you know.
All right, I have one more question before we move on to this.
Yeah.
Actually isn't even a Trump question. If there's anything more you want to say on Trump,
Nope.
I have a few more things, but there's always next week.
I was thinking that it would be interesting to
4 years.
do but we have plenty of time, a draft of the various territories he's claiming to try to take over or annex, because you got Greenland, you got Panama Canal, you got Canada.
the
We could
Gulf of
break
Mexico,
Canada.
kind of, at least just
Yeah.
as a
Gulf of
name.
America.
You could
Yeah,
break
I'm sorry, Gulf of America.
Canada up into provinces and sort of make them all individual draft choices.
Should we give something away? Like, as long as we're like,
Oh my God. We could give away Florida.
yeah,
I mean, I
Fine
think
with that.
I don't think that's happening.
I don't think that's happening. Texas sees themselves as their own republic. There's a new Cal
Maybe
exit
we could give away New York.
referendum there.
We could.
By the way, if I have always believed
The New York would be
that
better
New York
Singapore?
City or the New York metropolitan area could just be Singapore and be a city-state and operate incredibly effectively.
You know who
Yes.
likes this idea? I know you hate it whenever I bring this up. Like, this was like Norman Mailer's thing, right? I mean, it was actually about
I don't
New
hate-
York City being the 51st state.
Yeah, no, I don't hate Norman Mailer.
No,
I like a lot
you
of
just
his
hate it
writing.
when I bring that up as a relevant subject.
I feel like you
Overestimate
no, it's just,
sort of historical
I'm
tidbits.
just not sure that our listeners are all that aware of New York City hipster culture in the 1960s.
No, I'm sure they're not. They're not aware of New York hipster culture in like the 2020s,
Yeah.
much less the 1960s. No offense, listeners. I'm with you.
But yeah, no, I think New York City could probably.
I like the Singapore
The
idea.
thing about this, though, what
I like the
happens-
Singapore idea, too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what happens though, because I've gone through this in my head a bunch of times, is you
Have
have
you
this,
been ruminating on
this ruminate about it, yeah, this endless winnowing process, right? So you'd say like in the way, remember Atlanta tried to, the people of Buckhead tried to secede
yeah.
from Atlanta.
Wait, is that
Buckhead
dead?
It didn't happen.
Okay.
But Buckhead is like in a very wealthy neighborhood.
It's like the Upper
in
East Side.
Atlanta. Yeah. And
Okay.
Taking
and they
off.
were like,
Yeah,
you
it's
know
good
what?
stuff.
Our tax money, like we're spending far more than we're getting back for our neighborhood.
Yep.
Crime is way up, all of this shit. Like we're just better off on our own.
Right.
Keep our money, we'll govern ourselves. And they weren't able to do it. But, so New York City, clearly, I think you and I were having this debate the other day about
Yeah.
New York and federal, the disparity between what New York sends to D.C. and what we get back.
Yes.
So you could do that, but then you would say like, okay, well, why do I need these poor neighborhoods in Brooklyn then? Why do I need these suburbs that are less wealthy than those? And then eventually you just end up at the Upper East Side, right?
Well, but I would see that.
Tribeca maybe gets in there.
But we need each other. I do think that there is more of like we need like a whole economy, it can't just be one subset of people to have a successful governing body,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think that New York has so many different components to it. If let's say we've been throwing up state, what if the whole state? Then we have agriculture as part of it
We don't
too.
want upstate.
I
That
mean,
would
I
defeat
know
the
I'm
whole
saying
purpose.
that, but
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, but in thinking about it, I do think that the province of Ontario would clearly be the number one pick because Toronto is a city that you would want in the U.S. in terms of its wealth and productivity.
Oh, right. So that'd be number one on your list. The
I
Canadians
think
are going to love you if you're like,
I'm not saying this should
Trump.
happen. I'm just saying if I
Knock,
had,
knock.
Got it picked
if
out.
I could pay.
Talk about Toronto?
Like with Panama, have any American
Montreal's a
companies-
lot nicer of a city.
Montreal's
I think.
awesome,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's
I like
what?
Toronto too, though.
Well,
No offense to
Montreal
Toronto.
is like New Orleans or Charleston or Santa Fe or Savannah. I love all those cities. Like they're great places
Kinda
to go
broken,
eat and
a little
hang.
broken.
But like a little down and out. But like not except Charleston. Charleston's very wealthy at this point.
Yeah.
But like
to be broken.
super fun to walk around and amazing food and culture. But like for Panama Canal, are there any American like shipping companies saying like we're not getting the access we need?
no.
I don't know.
So
No.
like, is there
Wasn't
any
in the one
actual
article I read about
advantage?
it.
The
to
only
this?
thing I'm reading is that he's just obsessed with Like
All right,
that's
yeah.
it.
Well,
like,
no, but
history.
aren't the rates, the shipping rates really high? Or something like that?
But that's just dynamic pricing, right? Isn't that just based on the market?
I don't know.
Would it change if we had it? Are we not a market-based economy? Anyway,
Well, if it was up to Trump.
yeah.
Okay, so one question,
Yeah.
and then we're going to talk about scaffolding, and then you're going to give your recommendations.
Yes.
So I don't know if you felt this way. I was kind of bummed by the outcomes of football games yesterday. Kansas City, Philadelphia is not an interesting Super Bowl.
No,
to me.
but their Super Bowl
mostly
2
just
years
because of
ago
the
was a
cities.
good
Like I
match.
don't care about Kansas City or Philadelphia.
But do you remember the
It's just-
game when they played each other?
Oh yeah, they're
it
good
was
football
a good
teams.
game.
I just mean that like. So my question is. Are there cities that you will not root for no matter what? Like that you just because Philly is a city like as a sports city, I'm not ever going to root for a Philadelphia team
there are
ever.
Owners sometimes that I just decide I really don't like. Like when Daniel Snyder owned the Commanders,
The Redskins.
Yeah, I wouldn't have rooted for them. Whereas I was rooting for them yesterday against Belichick because Jaden Daniels.
The problem is that once you start discriminating on like the owner, there's very few teams you'd ever really want to root for. I mean, I agree that Daniel
Right.
Snyder
That's
is
a
really
good-
like
that's a good
the worst
point.
of the worst, but like still like if you saw all those guys in the lineup, you'd be like, you know what, maybe my life is better without sports.
Yeah,
This is also the first time that I'm hearing who's going to be in the Super Bowl. I'm not going to lie.
Kansas City,
wow.
Philadelphia.
Yeah, I know. I'm terrible.
Wait, so just to answer the question, is there a city that you would just never root for them?
I mean, Philly because they're
Yeah,
like our
'cause they're
rival,
jerks.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Boston.
So
yeah, Philly and Boston are kind of the same.
Yeah, for whatever reason, Lyle and I were debating this over the weekend in terms of like he asked me like in each league which team that I hate the most because for baseball my answer is still the Yankees,
Right.
Even though Phillies
Even
and
though
Braves would be
I'm
right
a friend of
there.
yours and I'm a
Yeah, all
Yankees
that,
fan.
yes.
You don't care.
And then for basketball, I said the Sixers, and he argued no, it has to be the Celtics. I said why? He said because the Celtics are at our level or even a little better, and the Sixers not really a factor.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, but I can beat such an asshole, and I never like Paul George and all that. And then for football was the Eagles, clearly, right?
Not the Patriots.
Well, no, as a Giants fan, I'm totally indifferent because one, they're not in our division, but two, every time we played them, Super Bowl we won.
Yeah.
So fine with me.
Twice.
Yeah. And then hockey, I don't care enough to have a view.
Okay. All right.
And I do root for the New Orleans Saints because I love the city. of New
Yeah.
Orleans.
See, that's the thing.
I
I
have always
rooted
been
for
my-
Buffalo. I don't know if I
Right.
love. Well, I do love Buffalo, but I badly wanted.
Yes.
I still feel bad about those 4 straight
Never
Super Bowls
happens.
that they didn't win.
Yeah.
And then they
I don't,
lost
because the Giants
yesterday.
won one of them. But yeah, totally. So
Okay, so let's talk about scaffolding.
Yeah, so I had my column in the Daily News yesterday about
Yes.
scaffolding. So there's legislation in the New York City Council that is sponsored by Keith Powers and kind of has the strong cooperation and backing of both Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine. And all three of them are going to be on Firewall together. I think we're trying to lock the date down, but I talked to all of them again yesterday, talk about their bill. And what the bill would do effectively is put an end to this sort of endless system of just scaffolding everywhere across New York City, especially lots of Manhattan and Brooklyn, all the time. So if you stretched it out, it would go from literally, we were talking Montreal, from Manhattan to Montreal. That's how much scaffolding we have. And the laws require both. You have two problems. One is the laws require inspections too frequently. So as a result, one, building's always having to do it. Two, sometimes by the time passes, they're almost ready for the next one. Second, there's no real enforcement. So if you just leave the scaffolding up because you think it's cheaper than putting it up and down, nothing happens to you, right? And so that you put those two things together, and what we have is just blocks and blocks and blocks of scaffolding, which is not a victimless crime, right? So the first thing is, it's shitty for the people who live. Like I remember we lived on 19th Street. There was this like funeral net cast over our building for 2 years, right? Where you look at the window and it was dark, and like that sucks. And by having all this endless requirements, the tenants or the owners, whoever lives there, have to pay more, landlords. For businesses, having scaffolding over your store, I can tell you this for a fact as a retail business owner, hurts because it just sort of, people don't see it nearly as well. And then bad shit happens more under scaffolding than not. More drug use, more kind of homeless encampment, more urination, more defecation, just more bad things, more crime. I talked to both Alvin and Eric Gonzalez, who's the Brooklyn DA, and I just asked them both, like, hey, do your people think this? And they both kind of said, not sure, I'll get back to you. And then they both called back later and said, yeah, they do think this, right? So you have a quality of life problem, you have a crime problem, you have a business and economic problem, and we have a solution. And the reason that I wrote this column is twofold. One is we did some polling out of Tusk Philanthropies just to see how New Yorkers feel about it. So we found first that 77% of New Yorkers want new scaffolding laws compared to just 8% who like things the way they are. 80% said scaffolding causes maintenance costs to go up for renters and homeowners, is bad for retail businesses, and encourages problems like drug use, homeless encampments, and safety threats. And 68% say that the period buildings should perform work and inspection should be shortened, and the length of time between inspections should be lengthened. So overwhelmingly, right, it's all like anywhere from like 5 to 10 to 1 in favor of reform. But Adrian Adams, who is the Speaker of the City Council, has chosen to not call the bill. The expectation was that it would be put on the aging calendar in the council in January. That did not happen. And the question is why? And I understand she has her own internal politics and her own rivalries and her own issues. And I get that, and I get how politics works, but I also know that you have a problem that is bad for all 8.5 million people that live here, that causes crime, causes harm, causes cost. And just because you have your own internal politics in your own, chamber or with other, elected officials, that doesn't give you the right to make 8.5 million people suffer. And so, I understand that they were not happy when I called her out in the Daily News yesterday. But, if you are listening, if you don't move the bill because you're just sticking with your petty rivalries, this is not going to be a one-time thing. So my hope would be that the Speaker will be willing to put the good of New York City, who she represents, who she is paid to represent, by the way. She takes a paycheck, ahead of her own angers and rivalries and jealousies and everything else, and that she moves the bill.
One question on that, and then we'll move to your recommendations. Yeah. So this is sort of like the third in a series of causes you've gotten involved with that are kind of like these pragmatic approaches to problems in New York City. So you have the closing of the weed shops, the broker's fees, and now we're talking about the scaffolding.
Yeah.
What do these sort of add up to if taken together? Like, is there?
I think there's two issues. Meg and I were talking about this over the weekend. Separate conversation from the New York City disparity of funding. Affordability and quality of life, right? So what all polling shows, but what our polling on the scaffolding showed as well, is there are two fundamental things that New Yorkers feel, people who live here. One, that it's too expensive, and two, that it's too dirty and dangerous, right? And that's what they want fixed. And there are not everything, so like, for example, I think the Adams administration has done really good work on housing, and I hope that it all helps, and I'm for all of it. But housing is complicated because it takes years and years to build, and there are market forces, and there's federal issues, and there's state issues. But then there are more tangible things, like so Megan pointed out over the weekend, like the city could just choose to fund pre-K more. Now, that would mean funding something else less, but could choose to do that, and that's an affordability issue for a lot of parents. When we passed the ban on broker's fees, that's affordability because it just literally made renting an apartment more expensive if you had to give an additional 15% of your annual rent to a broker. Illegal weed shops are just clearly bad. The notion that drugs are just for sale and the government doesn't do anything about it without licensing, without inspections, that sell to kids, and also just undermine all of the legal weed shops and all the effort they went through to do it the right way. And it's funny, there's almost a parallel with immigration, right? Where you see like a lot of Latinos, 45%, voted for Trump, and a lot of the reason why was immigration, because they felt like, hey, I went through the system, I waited in line, it's not fair that other people don't have to do that. The legal weed shops should be really out there banging away because, like, these illegal weed shops don't pay taxes, they didn't deal with licensing, they don't get inspected, the products they sell are much more dangerous, they sell it to kids. So that one to me is a tangible quality of life, scaffolding, other tangible quality of life. But there's other stuff too. So like I think it varies. Like, for example, last week we funded a campaign to expand the SHIELD law in New York to protect medical professionals who prescribe abortion medication to women in red states via telemedicine. And what the new bill specifically did was, when you get a prescription, your doctor's information is listed on the bottle. In this case, that information does not have to be listed because otherwise, the pill bottle goes to someone in Kentucky, police get it, and then all of a sudden they're going after the doctor in New York. School meals, I guess that's affordability, but it's also just sort of even more basic, which is kids eating. We had kind of fought really hard to get an increase of $140 million in school meal funding 2 years ago, and that led to 300,000 more kids getting food. Governor Hochul, to her great credit, now finished the job in her budget and proposed that all kids in New York State get free breakfast and lunch. We are running a big thank you campaign online right now for her. So yeah, some of the stuff is, I would say what they all have in common is that they're tangible things, right? It's legislation we can pass. It's government action we can take that will result in kids getting fed, women having access to abortion, scaffolding going down, brokers' fees being banned, weed shops being closed. And to me, it gets back to that, just to wrap this full circle, the purpose part of the first part of this podcast, which is like, you got to do things that can have actual results and impact, right? Like the people who think that they are doing something good for the world because they're tweeting and complaining, like that's bullshit. That is totally performative just for your friends to show them how righteous you are. Just like the same people who like do the charity circuit of like galas and boards, but they don't fucking care about anything. Same thing. Totally, that's just for you. That's not for, and as a result, you don't really feel good about yourself long term because you're not doing anything, right? So if you want to change things, like you got to fucking go make it happen. Recommendations.
Yeah. You have several.
I have several. So two books. One is called I'm Starting to Worry About This Black Box of Doom by Jason Pargin. Megan, I think you would especially like it because it is in many ways a novel about social media.
Okay.
It is about this woman who has to take this box across country and conscripts an Uber driver to take her, and he has all kinds of neuroses and issues and everything else. And as they go across the country, all of these various sort of rumors become viral about what's in the box and what they're doing. Ooh. And it's all about the FBI gets involved, but everyone's following them on Reddit and various social platforms. And it's sort of the juxtaposition combination of sort of the physical world and the digital world and all the ways that it kind of leads to crazy absurdity. Very fun book. The other one's called Mona Acts Out by Misha Berlinski. And it is about a actor who performs at this fictional but sort of Shakespeare company on the Lower East Side that had this sort of legendary impresario that got forced out for all kinds of Me Too stuff. And she's kind of not the twilight of her career, but she went from being sort of this, her beauty being the thing to now she's in her 40s and not as much. And she kind of has a little bit of a nervous breakdown and kind of skips out on Thanksgiving and kind of wanders around New York City instead, getting into various situations. And it's a really good book. I think it could be a contender for the 2025 Gotham Book Prize, which is not the one. We will be announcing the nominees for the 2024 this week. But I like this a lot.
How many books are being nominated?
I think 11 or 12.
Yeah.
There was 12, but then there was some issue over the weekend with one of them, and I don't remember what it was. So I think
stay
it's 12.
tuned for the announcement.
I think it's 12. Yeah. Corey's back from his honeymoon today, so
yes.
We're waiting for Corey.
Okay.
And then the two movies, September 5th, which Hugo, you said you saw as well.
Yeah.
Did you like it?
I did. I think it was a B+.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I give it an A-, but
I loved the conceit. So it's related to the hostage taking at Munich in 1972 Olympics, but told from the perspective of the ABC crew and reporters and their whole and they were like within like 100 yards of where the stuff was happening, but they didn't really know what was happening. And it's like kind of a mystery almost that they try to solve, even though you kind of know what it is, or at least you could know. Although I really advise, one of the things I would say to people who want to see the movies, don't read about the like what happened at Munich, because if you discover it in real time with the
less you know about it.
I did know, because I've read that book, Vengeance. There was a movie version that came out of it maybe about 20 years ago. I forget what it was called. But of course I didn't remember every fact, but I knew like the broad brushstroke, which then seemed to keep conflicting what was happening in the movie, because I didn't remember, I wasn't even alive yet, like the sequence of events. And so if anything, I was kind of more confused as a result. But with that all said, I thought it was a really good, when a movie can basically take place in one room and hold your attention the entire time, that's impressive. And what I also loved about it, it was only an hour and a half. Probably with the credits and all that, it was really only like an hour 20.
Best kind of movies to see.
It was like a really good play.
I was so happy about that. Yeah, it was like a really good play.
Yeah.
And the other one was A Real Pain, which is the Jesse Eisenberg movie with Kieran Culkin, where they are going to tour a concentration camp in Europe, and they go with a group of people and to look at their grandmother's house in Poland. And it's a good movie. One of the reasons I watched it is we are going to Dachau in